Have you ever noticed? No matter where you go, your mind follows you. You change places, you change people, you try to distract yourself. But the same thoughts keep coming back, again and again. What if the problem is not your life, but the way your mind is holding on to it? And what if you are not trapped by your thoughts, but by your belief in them? Before we go deeper, tell me something honestly. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it in your world right now? Understanding the root of negative thinking. Negative thinking does not begin as something big, overwhelming, or obvious. It begins in a very quiet and almost invisible way, so subtle that most people never notice the moment it actually starts. One small thought appears in the mind, and because it feels familiar, you do not question it. It may be a memory, a fear, a doubt, or even a simple interpretation of something that just happened. At that moment, nothing feels dangerous, nothing feels out of control, and yet this is exactly where the entire chain of suffering begins. In the teachings of the Buddha, the problem is never the appearance of a thought. Thoughts arise naturally, just as sounds arise, just as sensations arise, just as everything in life arises. The mind is designed to produce thoughts, just as the heart is designed to beat. So trying to stop thoughts completely is like trying to stop the wind from blowing. It is not only difficult, it is unnecessary. The real issue begins when you do not see the thought clearly for what it is, and instead, you move closer to it without awareness. What usually happens is this: a thought appears, and instead of observing it, you immediately engage with it. You start to analyze it, react to it, and slowly you begin to believe it. This belief happens so quickly that you do not even realize you made a choice. It feels automatic. It feels as if the thought is telling you the truth about your life, about your future, or about who you are. And once belief enters, the thought is no longer just a thought. It becomes something heavier. It becomes something that affects your emotions, your body, and your entire state of being. The Buddha explained that this is how suffering quietly grows. Not because the thought itself is powerful, but because you give it power through identification. You take something temporary and treat it as something permanent. You take something that is simply passing through the mind and treat it as something that defines you. And once this identification happens, the mind begins to build around it. It brings more thoughts, more memories, more imagined scenarios, and suddenly you are no longer watching your mind, you are living inside it. If you observe carefully, you will notice that most negative thoughts are not new. They are patterns. They repeat in different forms, but they carry the same energy. The same fear appears again and again, the same doubt returns in different situations, the same inner voice speaks with slightly different words. This repetition creates the illusion that the thought must be important, that it must be true, because it keeps coming back. But in reality, it is only repeating because it has been fed many times before. Every time you give attention to a negative thought, you strengthen it. Every time you react to it emotionally, you deepen its impact. Every time you believe it without questioning, you allow it to become part of your identity. And over time, this creates a habit. The mind becomes used to thinking in this way, and it begins to do it automatically. This is why negative thinking can feel so constant and so difficult to escape. It is not because you are weak, and it is not because something is wrong with you. It is simply because the pattern has been repeated so many times that it now feels natural. But here is where everything begins to change. The moment you bring awareness to this process, the moment you begin to see how a single thought turns into a chain of suffering, you are no longer completely trapped. Awareness creates a small distance between you and the thought. And in that distance, something powerful happens. You begin to realize that the thought is not you. It is something appearing within you, but it is not your identity. This realization may seem small, but it is the foundation of freedom. Because if the thought is not you, then you do not have to follow it. You do not have to believe it. You do not have to build your reality around it. You can simply observe it as it is, without adding anything to it. And when you do this, something unexpected happens. The thought begins to lose its strength. It does not disappear immediately, but it no longer controls you in the same way. The Buddha did not teach people to fight their thoughts, because fighting creates more resistance, and resistance creates more tension. Instead, he pointed toward understanding. When you understand the nature of thoughts, when you see that they are temporary, conditioned, and constantly changing, you stop giving them the same level of importance. You stop treating every thought as something meaningful, something urgent, something that must be solved. And slowly, very naturally, the grip of negative thinking begins to loosen. Not because you forced it to stop, but because you stopped feeding it. You stopped identifying with it. You stopped turning it into something bigger than it actually is. And in that process, you begin to experience moments of clarity, moments where the mind becomes quiet without effort. So the root of negative thinking is not the thought itself. It is the unconscious habit of believing and following every thought that arises. And the beginning of freedom is not in controlling the mind, but in seeing it clearly. When you see clearly, you step out of the cycle. When you step out of the cycle, the mind begins to settle. And when the mind settles, you begin to experience something that was always there beneath the noise, a quiet, steady awareness that is not disturbed by every passing thought. This is where the journey truly begins. Why trying to control your mind makes it stronger. After you begin to understand how negative thinking starts, a deeper layer of the problem slowly becomes visible, and this is where many people unknowingly trap themselves even further. The moment you realize that your thoughts are creating suffering, your first instinct is to try to control them. You want to remove negative thoughts, replace them with positive ones, and create a peaceful mind through effort. This seems logical, and it feels like the right thing to do, but in the teachings of the Buddha, this approach is itself part of the problem. The mind does not respond well to force. The more you try to push something away, the more attention you give to it, and attention is exactly what keeps thoughts alive. When a negative thought appears and you immediately try to control it, argue with it, or suppress it, you are not actually removing it. You are engaging with it in a different form. You are telling the mind that this thought is important, that it must be dealt with, that it requires your energy. And because the mind is conditioned to follow attention, it begins to return to that same thought again and again. This creates a cycle that feels exhausting. A thought appears, you react, you try to fix it, and instead of disappearing, it becomes stronger. Over time, you may even feel frustrated with your own mind, wondering why it does not listen, why it keeps producing the same negativity, why it refuses to stay calm. But the truth is, the mind is simply following the pattern you have been reinforcing. Every attempt to control it becomes another layer of involvement, another form of attachment, another way of feeding the very thing you are trying to escape. The Buddha pointed toward a different understanding. He did not teach control in the sense of forcing the mind into silence. Instead, he taught understanding and observation. He showed that the mind behaves according to causes and conditions, and when you understand those causes clearly, the need for control begins to disappear. You begin to see that thoughts are not enemies that need to be defeated, but processes that need to be understood. If you observe closely, you will notice that the desire to control your thoughts is itself another thought. It arises in the same way as any other mental event. It carries a feeling of urgency, a sense that something must be done, that something is wrong, that the mind must be fixed. But this thought, like all others, is temporary. It is not a command you must obey. It is simply another movement within the mind. When you begin to see this, something shifts. Instead of reacting immediately, you pause. You notice the thought without following it, and you also notice the urge to control without acting on it. In this moment, you are no longer trapped in the cycle. You are aware of it. And this awareness creates space. In that space, the thought is still present, but it is not being fed. It is not being strengthened by reaction. It is allowed to exist without interference. And when a thought is not fed, it naturally loses energy. It begins to fade on its own, just as a fire fades when no more fuel is added. This is not something you force. It is something you allow. At first, this can feel uncomfortable because the mind is used to constant activity. It is used to reacting, fixing, controlling, and doing something with every experience. Sitting in awareness without reacting can feel unfamiliar, even uneasy. But if you stay with it, if you continue observing without interference, you begin to notice a subtle but powerful change. The intensity of thoughts decreases. The urgency fades. The mind becomes less aggressive in its patterns. And you start to experience moments of quiet that do not come from forcing the mind to stop, but from no longer disturbing it with constant reaction. This is where true understanding begins to deepen. You realize that peace is not something you create by controlling the mind. It is something that reveals itself when you stop interfering with it. The mind, when left undisturbed, has a natural tendency toward balance. It does not need to be forced into stillness. It returns to stillness when it is no longer being pushed and pulled by attachment and resistance. The Buddha described this as a middle way, a path that avoids extremes. Not suppressing thoughts, and not indulging them, but simply observing them with clarity. This balanced awareness allows the mind to settle naturally, without conflict, without struggle. And as this understanding grows, your relationship with negative thinking begins to transform. Thoughts still appear, but they no longer trigger the same reaction. You no longer feel the need to control every mental movement. You begin to trust the process. You begin to trust that thoughts will arise and pass on their own, without needing your constant involvement. This trust is not blind belief. It comes from direct experience. Each time you observe without reacting, each time you allow a thought to pass without interference, you see for yourself that it loses its power. And this repeated seeing strengthens your confidence in awareness itself. Over time, this becomes a new way of being. Instead of living in constant conflict with your mind, you begin to live in understanding. Instead of trying to control everything, you begin to allow things to unfold. And in this allowing, there is a quiet strength, a stability that does not depend on forcing the mind into a certain state. So the deeper truth is this: the more you try to control your thoughts, the more you remain connected to them. But the moment you stop trying to control, the moment you step back into awareness, you begin to experience a different kind of freedom. A freedom that does not come from changing the mind, but from no longer being controlled by it. Seeing the truth of thoughts without becoming them. As you continue observing the mind without trying to control it, a deeper realization begins to unfold, and this realization changes your entire relationship with negative thinking. Up to this point, you may have understood that thoughts arise on their own and that reacting to them strengthens them, but now you begin to see something even more subtle and far more powerful. You begin to see that the problem is not just the thoughts themselves, and it is not even your reaction to them alone, but the way you unconsciously become them. Most of the time, when a thought appears, you do not experience it as something separate from you. You experience it as yourself. If the thought says something negative, you feel as if that negativity belongs to you. If the thought carries fear, you feel as if you are afraid. If the thought carries doubt, you feel as if you are not enough. This merging happens so quickly and so automatically that it feels completely natural, and because it feels natural, it goes unnoticed. But when awareness becomes deeper, you begin to notice that there is a difference between the thought and the one who is aware of the thought. This difference is subtle at first, but once you see it, it begins to expand. You realize that the thought is something that appears within your awareness, not something that defines it. You begin to recognize that there is a space in which the thought arises, exists for a moment, and then disappears, and that space is not affected by the content of the thought itself. This shift may seem small, but it changes everything. Because if you are no longer inside the thought, then the thought no longer has complete control over your state. It still appears, it still carries its usual patterns, but now it is being observed instead of being lived. And this observation weakens the illusion that the thought is who you are. When you look carefully, you begin to see that thoughts are not continuous in the way they appear to be. They seem continuous because one thought leads to another very quickly, creating the impression of a constant stream. But in reality, each thought is separate. It arises, stays briefly, and passes. The mind simply fills the gap so quickly that you do not notice the space between them. And it is in this space that freedom exists. Negative thinking survives because you are not aware of these gaps. You move from one thought to the next without pause, without seeing the transition. And in that continuous movement, the mind creates a sense of solidity. It feels like a constant reality, something that does not stop. But when awareness becomes sharper, you begin to notice the beginning of a thought, the middle of it, and its end. You begin to see its entire life cycle. At the moment you see a thought from beginning to end, you are no longer fully inside it. You are witnessing it. And witnessing breaks identification. It shows you that the thought is not permanent, not solid, not something you need to carry forward. It reveals that the thought is simply a temporary event, arising due to conditions and disappearing when those conditions are no longer present. Another important realization begins to appear at this stage. You notice that thoughts are not entirely under your control. They appear without your permission. You do not decide the next thought before it arises. It simply comes. And if thoughts arise without your direct control, then how can they define who you are? How can something that appears on its own be your true identity? This question begins to dissolve the deep attachment you have to thinking. You start to see that what you previously considered yourself is actually a collection of mental events that come and go. And if they come and go, then they cannot be the foundation of something permanent. They cannot be the core of who you are. This does not create emptiness in a negative sense. It creates space. A space that is not filled with constant identification, not filled with the need to react to everything that appears. And within this space, there is a quiet stability. A presence that is not shaken by every thought, because it is not built from thought. As this understanding deepens, negative thinking begins to lose its intensity. The thoughts still arise, but they feel lighter. They do not pull you in as strongly. They do not create the same emotional reaction. And even when they do create a reaction, you are aware of it. You see the process as it unfolds, and that seeing itself reduces its power. You begin to live differently. Instead of being driven by thoughts, you become aware of them as they appear. Instead of reacting immediately, you pause. And in that pause, there is choice. Not the kind of forced decision-making that comes from trying to control everything, but a natural clarity that allows you to respond rather than react. This is the beginning of real freedom from negative thinking. Not because thoughts have stopped, but because you are no longer lost inside them. You are no longer becoming every thought that appears. You are no longer treating every mental movement as something that must be followed. You are simply aware. And in that awareness, something becomes very clear. Thoughts come and go, emotions rise and fall, experiences change constantly, but there is something that remains present through all of it. Something that observes without being affected, something that witnesses without becoming involved. When you begin to rest in that awareness, even for a moment, you experience a kind of peace that does not depend on controlling the mind. It is not created by forcing thoughts to stop. It is discovered by seeing that you were never the thoughts to begin with. And once this is seen clearly, even if only for brief moments, the entire structure of negative thinking begins to weaken. Because it can only control you as long as you are inside it. The moment you step out and observe, the moment you stop becoming the thought and start seeing it, its power begins to dissolve. This is not something that happens instantly or permanently. The mind will continue its patterns, it will try to pull you back into identification, it will present thoughts that feel real and urgent. But now you have seen something deeper. You have seen that there is a space beyond thought, and you can return to it again and again. And each time you return, the hold of negative thinking becomes weaker, and your connection to awareness becomes stronger, until eventually, what once felt overwhelming becomes just another passing movement in the mind, appearing and disappearing within a much larger field of calm and clarity that remains untouched. The illusion of control and why it keeps you trapped in suffering. As your awareness deepens and you begin to see thoughts without becoming them, another layer of understanding slowly reveals itself, and this layer is even more subtle than everything you have seen before. It is not just about thoughts arising and passing, and it is not only about your identification with them, but about the hidden belief that you must control your inner world in order to feel safe, stable, and at peace. This belief is so deeply rooted that it often goes unnoticed. You may not consciously say to yourself that you need to control everything happening in your mind, but your actions reveal it clearly. The moment a negative thought appears, there is an immediate movement inside you that tries to correct it, replace it, suppress it, or escape from it. This movement feels natural, almost automatic, and it carries a strong sense of urgency, as if something is wrong and must be fixed immediately. But if you observe this carefully, you begin to see that this urge to control is itself another layer of mental activity. It is not separate from the thinking process. It is part of the same pattern. A thought appears, and then another thought appears that says this should not be happening, that it must be changed, that it must be removed. And without realizing it, you have entered into a conflict, not just with the original thought, but with your own mind. This inner conflict is one of the primary sources of suffering, because it creates division within you. One part of the mind is producing thoughts, while another part is trying to stop them. One part is expressing fear, while another part is resisting that fear. And this constant opposition creates tension, a feeling that something is not right, that something is out of place, that you are not as you should be. The deeper truth begins to emerge when you realize that this conflict is not necessary. The mind does not need to be controlled in the way you have been trying to control it. The more you attempt to dominate your thoughts, the more you strengthen the very patterns you are trying to escape. Because every act of control is still an act of engagement, and every engagement feeds the cycle. When you try to push a thought away, you are still giving it attention. When you try to replace it, you are still acknowledging its presence. When you resist it, you are creating tension around it. And this tension gives the thought more energy, more significance, more importance than it originally had. What began as a simple mental event becomes a prolonged experience, not because of the thought itself, but because of your reaction to it. At this stage, a profound shift becomes possible. Instead of trying to control the mind, you begin to understand it. Instead of reacting to every thought, you begin to allow it. This does not mean you agree with the thought, and it does not mean you follow it. It means you stop interfering with its natural movement. You let it arise, you let it exist, and you let it pass, without adding resistance or attachment. This approach may feel unfamiliar at first, because it goes against the habit of doing something in response to everything. You are used to acting, correcting, fixing, and managing your inner world. But now you are stepping into a different way of relating to your mind, one that is based on observation rather than control. As you practice this, you begin to notice something very important. Thoughts begin to lose their urgency. They still appear, but they do not demand the same level of attention. They do not pull you in as strongly. And even when they do carry emotional weight, you are able to stay present without being completely absorbed. This is because you are no longer creating additional layers of conflict. You are no longer fighting the mind, and without that fight, the mind begins to settle on its own. Not because you forced it into silence, but because you removed the conditions that were keeping it active. Another realization begins to unfold at this point. You start to see that the idea of complete control was never realistic to begin with. Thoughts arise based on countless conditions, many of which are outside your direct awareness. Past experiences, learned patterns, emotional memories, and external influences all contribute to the movement of the mind. Trying to control all of this through force is not only difficult, it is impossible. But understanding this does not create helplessness. It creates freedom. Because you realize that you do not need to control everything in order to be at peace. Peace does not come from having a perfectly controlled mind. It comes from not being disturbed by the natural movement of the mind. This is a very different kind of stability. It is not based on eliminating thoughts or creating a specific mental state. It is based on your relationship with whatever arises. When that relationship is rooted in awareness and non-resistance, the mind can move freely without creating suffering. Over time, this understanding deepens into direct experience. You begin to trust that thoughts will come and go on their own. You begin to see that emotions will rise and fall without needing to be controlled. You begin to feel that you do not have to manage every internal experience in order to feel okay. And with this trust, a certain relaxation enters your experience. The tightness that came from constant control begins to soften. The pressure to fix everything begins to fade. And in its place, there is a quiet openness, a willingness to allow life to unfold without constant interference. This openness is not passive. It is not indifference. It is a form of clarity that sees things as they are without immediately trying to change them. And in that clarity, the mind naturally becomes more balanced, more stable, and less reactive. Negative thinking still appears, but it no longer dominates your experience. It no longer defines your state. It becomes just one aspect of the mind, one movement among many, not something that must be eliminated or controlled at all costs. And this is where a deeper freedom begins to take root. Not the freedom that comes from having a perfect mind, but the freedom that comes from no longer being controlled by the need to control. A freedom that allows you to remain steady even as thoughts come and go, a freedom that is not dependent on what is happening in the mind, but on how you relate to it. When this is seen clearly, the entire struggle with negative thinking begins to dissolve. Not because the thoughts are gone, but because the one who is struggling with them is no longer engaged in the same way. There is awareness, there is presence, and within that presence, there is a quiet peace that does not need to be created, only recognized. And once you begin to live from this understanding, even in small moments, you realize that the mind was never the true problem. The problem was the constant effort to control what was never meant to be controlled. And in letting go of that effort, you begin to experience a different kind of life, one that is not driven by fear, not shaped by constant reaction, but grounded in a steady awareness that remains present through everything that arises and passes away. The deep habit of attachment and how it quietly feeds negative thinking. As your understanding continues to deepen and you begin to see thoughts without immediately reacting or trying to control them, a more hidden layer of the mind slowly becomes visible, and this layer is often the true source behind the persistence of negative thinking. It is not just the thoughts themselves, and it is not only your reaction to them, but something far more subtle that operates beneath both of these processes. This deeper layer is attachment, and it is so natural, so familiar, that most of the time it is never questioned. Attachment does not always appear as something obvious like holding on to a person or a possession. It appears in much quieter and more refined forms. It appears as holding on to an idea of how things should be, holding on to expectations about how life must unfold, holding on to an image of yourself that you believe you must protect. And when these attachments are not met, when reality does not match these inner expectations, the mind begins to generate resistance, and from that resistance, negative thinking begins to grow. If you observe closely, you will begin to notice that many of your negative thoughts are not random. They are connected to something you are holding on to. When something does not go the way you expected, the mind reacts. When someone behaves in a way that does not match your internal image of them, the mind reacts. When your idea of yourself is challenged, the mind reacts. And these reactions take the form of thoughts, often repetitive, often charged with emotion, often difficult to let go of. The deeper you look, the more you begin to see that the thought itself is not the starting point. The attachment is. The thought is simply the expression of that attachment being disturbed. It is the mind's attempt to restore what it believes has been lost or threatened. And because attachment is rooted in a sense of, this must be this way, any deviation from that expectation creates tension. That tension then fuels the cycle of thinking. This is why some thoughts feel so persistent. It is not because they are inherently powerful, but because they are connected to something you are not willing to release. The mind keeps returning to them because it is trying to resolve a situation that conflicts with your attachment. It keeps replaying scenarios, analyzing possibilities, imagining different outcomes, all in an attempt to regain a sense of control or certainty. But as you continue observing with awareness, a realization begins to emerge. You begin to see that holding on to these attachments does not bring stability. It creates instability. It creates a constant friction between what is and what you believe should be. And this friction is experienced as discomfort, as restlessness, as dissatisfaction. It keeps the mind active, searching, reacting, and never fully at ease. When this becomes clear, a new possibility opens. Instead of trying to fix every thought that arises, you begin to look deeper at what you are holding on to. You begin to question the necessity of these attachments. You begin to see that many of them are not essential for your well-being. They are patterns, habits of the mind that have been reinforced over time, but they are not fixed truths. Letting go of attachment does not mean you stop caring about life. It does not mean you become distant or indifferent. It means you stop insisting that life must unfold in a specific way for you to feel at peace. It means you allow reality to be as it is, without constantly comparing it to an internal standard that may not even be realistic. At first, this may feel like a loss. The mind may resist this idea because it is used to relying on attachments for a sense of identity and security. It may feel as though letting go means giving up control, giving up certainty, giving up something important. But as you stay with the process, as you observe without rushing to conclusions, you begin to notice something unexpected. When you loosen your attachment, the tension begins to dissolve. The need to constantly think about a situation begins to fade. The repetitive thoughts lose their urgency because the underlying conflict is no longer being fueled. What once felt like a problem that needed to be solved begins to feel like something that can simply be allowed to exist without interference. This shift does not happen instantly. Attachments are often deeply ingrained, and they may continue to arise in different forms. But each time you notice them, each time you see how they influence your thinking, you create an opportunity to release them, even if only slightly. And each small release creates space. It creates lightness. It reduces the weight that the mind has been carrying. Over time, this process leads to a profound transformation. The mind becomes less reactive because it is no longer holding on to rigid expectations. Thoughts still arise, but they do not carry the same emotional intensity. Situations still unfold, but they do not disturb you in the same way. You begin to experience a sense of ease that is not dependent on everything going your way, but on your ability to remain open to whatever arises. This is where negative thinking begins to lose its foundation completely. Without attachment, there is nothing for it to grow from. There is no internal resistance to fuel it, no expectation to conflict with reality, no rigid identity to defend. The mind becomes more flexible, more adaptable, more at peace with the natural flow of life. And as this understanding deepens, you begin to see that freedom is not about changing everything outside of you, and it is not about forcing the mind into silence. It is about releasing the inner grip that has been creating tension all along. It is about allowing things to be as they are, without constantly trying to shape them according to your preferences. In this state, there is a quiet stability. Not the kind that comes from controlling every outcome, but the kind that comes from not being disturbed by change. A stability that remains even when thoughts arise, even when emotions move, even when life does not follow a predictable path. And this stability is not something you create. It is something that reveals itself when attachment begins to fade. It is the natural state that was always present beneath the layers of clinging and resistance. And once you begin to experience it, even briefly, you realize that negative thinking was never something you needed to fight. It was something that naturally dissolves when the conditions that support it are no longer there. This is the deeper understanding of the mind, and this is where true freedom begins to take shape, not through effort and control, but through clarity and release, allowing the mind to return to its natural balance, where thoughts come and go without creating unnecessary suffering, and where awareness remains steady, open, and undisturbed. The illusion of self and how it quietly sustains negative thinking. As your awareness continues to deepen and you begin to loosen attachment to thoughts, emotions, and expectations, there comes a point where an even more fundamental layer of the mind begins to reveal itself, and this layer is often the most difficult to see because it has been present for so long that it feels completely natural and unquestionable. This layer is the sense of a fixed self, the feeling that there is a solid I at the center of all your thoughts, experiences, and reactions, the one who is thinking, feeling, struggling, and trying to become something. This sense of self feels real because it is constantly reinforced by the mind. Every thought that appears seems to belong to someone. Every emotion feels personal. Every experience is interpreted as happening to me. And because this pattern has been repeated throughout your life, it creates a strong impression that there is a stable identity behind everything, something that must be protected, improved, and defended at all times. But as you observe more carefully, something begins to feel less certain. You start to notice that what you call yourself is not as fixed as it once seemed. Your thoughts are constantly changing. Your emotions shift from one moment to the next. Your opinions, beliefs, and reactions evolve over time. Even the way you see yourself today is different from how you saw yourself in the past. And if everything that makes up your experience is changing, then what exactly is permanent within it? This question does not lead to confusion when seen clearly. It leads to insight. Because you begin to realize that the sense of a fixed self is not something solid, but something constructed. It is built from memories, habits, and repeated patterns of thinking. It is a narrative that the mind creates to organize experience, to give a sense of continuity, but it is not an unchanging reality. This realization has a direct and powerful impact on negative thinking. Because most negative thoughts are not just neutral observations, they are connected to this sense of self. When a thought arises saying something is wrong, it is often interpreted as something being wrong with you. When fear appears, it feels like something is threatening you. When doubt arises, it feels like it is describing you. And this personal connection gives the thought its emotional weight. If the thought were seen as just a passing event, it would not carry the same intensity. But because it is linked to the idea of a self that must be protected or improved, it becomes serious, important, and difficult to ignore. The mind becomes involved, trying to fix, defend, or escape, and in doing so, it strengthens the very pattern that created the discomfort. As awareness deepens further, you begin to see that the thought does not actually belong to a fixed self. It arises on its own, based on conditions, just like any other mental event. The sense of I that claims it is also part of the process. It is another thought, another layer added on top, creating the impression of ownership. When this is seen directly, not as an idea but as an experience, something begins to shift. The thoughts still arise, the emotions still move, but the sense of ownership begins to weaken. You no longer feel that every thought defines you or that every emotion is a reflection of who you are. Instead, you begin to see everything as part of a flow, a continuous movement of experience that does not need to be held onto or resisted. This does not create emptiness in a negative sense. It creates space and freedom. Because without the constant need to defend a fixed identity, there is less tension in the mind. There is less need to react to every thought. There is less urgency to resolve every inner conflict. The mind begins to relax because it is no longer carrying the weight of maintaining an image of self. Another important shift happens at this stage. You begin to see that much of your negative thinking was actually an attempt to protect or improve this imagined self. Thoughts about not being good enough, about needing to be better, about fearing judgment, all revolve around maintaining a certain identity. But when you see that this identity is not fixed, these thoughts lose their foundation. They may still appear out of habit, but they no longer feel as convincing. They no longer feel as urgent. You begin to recognize them as patterns rather than truths. And with that recognition, their power begins to dissolve. This process does not happen instantly or completely all at once. The sense of self is deeply conditioned, and it may continue to reappear in subtle ways. But each time you observe it, each time you see how thoughts and emotions are connected to this sense of identity, you weaken its hold. You begin to live less from the idea of who you think you are, and more from direct awareness of what is happening in the present moment. In this awareness, there is no need to define yourself constantly. There is no need to hold on to a fixed image. There is simply experience unfolding, moment by moment, without the extra layer of identification. And in this unfolding, there is a natural ease, a sense of openness that is not restricted by rigid concepts of self. As this becomes more stable, negative thinking loses one of its deepest supports. Because it can no longer rely on a fixed identity to attach itself to. It can no longer convince you that it is describing who you are. It becomes just another movement in the mind, something that appears and disappears without needing to be taken personally. And this is where a profound freedom begins to emerge. Not the freedom of having no thoughts or no emotions, but the freedom of not being defined by them. The freedom of experiencing life without constantly filtering it through the lens of a fixed self. The freedom of allowing everything to arise and pass without holding onto it as part of your identity. In this freedom, the mind becomes lighter, more flexible, more at peace. Thoughts still come and go, but they do not create the same level of disturbance. Emotions still move, but they do not overwhelm in the same way. There is a deeper stability that comes from not being tied to every mental event, a stability that remains even as the surface of the mind continues to change. And in this stability, you begin to experience something that was always present but often overlooked, a quiet awareness that is not limited by thoughts, not defined by identity, and not disturbed by the constant movement of the mind. This awareness becomes your natural resting place, and from this place, negative thinking no longer has the same influence over your experience. Because you are no longer living as the thoughts, or as the identity built around them. You are simply aware of them, and in that awareness, there is space, there is clarity, and there is a freedom that does not depend on controlling anything, but on seeing everything as it truly is, constantly changing, constantly moving, and never fixed. Living in freedom beyond negative thinking. As your understanding matures through observation, non-reaction, and the gradual release of attachment, something profound begins to unfold within your experience, something that cannot be fully explained through concepts alone but can only be recognized directly through awareness. At this stage, the journey is no longer about fixing negative thinking, controlling the mind, or even trying to understand every inner movement in detail. It becomes something much simpler, yet much deeper. It becomes about living in a way where the mind is no longer the center of your identity, and where awareness itself becomes the foundation of your experience. For most of your life, the mind has been at the center of everything. Every decision, every reaction, every feeling has been filtered through thought. The mind has acted as the interpreter of reality, constantly labeling, judging, comparing, and trying to create a sense of control. And because of this, your sense of peace has been dependent on the state of your thoughts. When thoughts are calm, you feel calm. When thoughts are negative, you feel disturbed. This dependency creates a fragile kind of stability, one that is constantly shifting based on the movement of the mind. But now, after seeing the nature of thoughts, after observing how they arise and pass, after understanding how attachment and identification give them power, something begins to shift at the deepest level. You begin to realize that your peace does not need to depend on the condition of your thoughts. You begin to see that awareness itself is already stable, already present, and already undisturbed, regardless of what the mind is doing. This realization changes everything, because it removes the need to constantly manage your inner experience. You no longer feel compelled to fix every thought or resolve every emotion. You no longer feel the urgency to control what is happening within you. Instead, there is a natural allowing, a quiet acceptance of the mind as it is, without interference. This does not mean that thoughts disappear completely. The mind continues to function, it continues to produce ideas, memories, and reactions, because that is its nature. But the difference now is that these movements are no longer taken as personal or absolute. They are seen as part of a process, part of a flow that does not define who you are. As you live from this understanding, you begin to notice a new kind of space within your experience. Thoughts arise, but they do not fill the entire field of awareness. Emotions appear, but they do not overwhelm your sense of presence. There is a background of stillness that remains, even as everything on the surface continues to change. This stillness is not something you create. It is something that becomes visible when the constant interference of reaction and attachment begins to fade. It has always been there, beneath the noise of the mind, beneath the layers of identification, quietly present in every moment. At this stage, life begins to feel different, not because external circumstances have changed, but because your relationship with them has transformed. Situations that once triggered strong reactions now pass with less disturbance. Thoughts that once felt overwhelming now appear lighter, less convincing. Even when challenges arise, there is a sense of space around them, a sense that they are not consuming your entire experience. This does not mean that difficulties disappear or that you become completely unaffected by life. It means that your inner stability is no longer entirely dependent on what happens. There is a deeper ground of awareness that remains steady, even when the surface of experience becomes active. Another important aspect of this stage is the reduction of unnecessary mental effort. Previously, much of your energy was spent thinking, analyzing, worrying, and trying to control outcomes. This constant activity created a sense of exhaustion, as if the mind was always working, always trying to solve something. But as you begin to live more from awareness, this effort naturally decreases. You begin to act more directly, without overthinking every step. You begin to respond to situations with clarity rather than reacting from habit. Decisions become simpler, not because you have more information, but because you are less clouded by unnecessary thought. There is a sense of flow in your actions, a natural alignment with what is happening, rather than a constant struggle against it. This simplicity extends into your emotional life as well. Emotions still arise, but they are experienced more fully and more directly, without the added layer of mental resistance. When sadness appears, it is felt without being turned into a story. When fear arises, it is observed without being amplified by endless thinking. And because there is less resistance, emotions move through more quickly, without becoming long-lasting states. As this way of living becomes more familiar, a deeper sense of freedom begins to take root. Not the freedom of having a perfect life, but the freedom of not being controlled by the mind's constant movement. A freedom that allows you to experience life as it is, without the need to constantly shape it according to your expectations. This freedom also brings a sense of openness. You are no longer confined to a rigid identity or a fixed way of seeing things. You are more flexible, more adaptable, more present. You can engage with life fully, without being weighed down by constant mental commentary. There is a lightness in your experience, a sense that you are not carrying unnecessary burdens. At the same time, there is a deeper clarity about what truly matters. Without the noise of constant negative thinking, you are able to see more clearly what is meaningful and what is not. You are less distracted by trivial concerns, less caught up in unnecessary conflicts. Your attention becomes more focused, more intentional, more aligned with what is real in the present moment. This clarity naturally influences your actions. You begin to act with greater awareness, not because you are forcing yourself to behave in a certain way, but because you are more connected to the present moment. Your responses become more balanced, more thoughtful, and less driven by unconscious patterns. Over time, this way of being becomes your natural state. Not something you have to maintain through effort, but something that arises from understanding. You no longer need to constantly remind yourself to be aware or to let go. These qualities become part of how you experience life. Negative thinking may still appear occasionally, because the mind continues to function, but it no longer has the same impact. It is seen quickly, understood easily, and allowed to pass without creating a prolonged disturbance. It becomes just another aspect of the mind's activity, not something that defines your state or controls your experience. And this is where the journey reaches a kind of completion, not in the sense that there is nothing more to understand, but in the sense that the fundamental relationship with the mind has changed. You are no longer living inside every thought, no longer reacting to every mental movement, no longer defined by every emotion. You are living from awareness. From a place that is already whole, already present, already at peace. And in this place, you begin to see life as it truly is, not through the distortion of constant thinking, but with clarity, simplicity, and openness. This is the freedom that does not depend on controlling the mind, but on understanding it so deeply that it no longer controls you. This is the quiet end of the struggle. And the beginning of a different way of living, where peace is not something you chase, but something you recognize as already present, here, in this moment, untouched by the constant movement of thought, steady, silent, and always available. There comes a moment, not loud, not dramatic, but deeply quiet, where you begin to see that nothing was ever truly wrong with you. All the struggle, all the overthinking, all the heaviness you carried, was never because you were broken, it was because you were looking at your mind without understanding it. You believed every thought. You followed every feeling. You tried to control what was never meant to be controlled. And slowly, that created a world inside you, that felt heavy, real, and difficult to escape. But now, something has changed. Not outside, but within. You have seen that thoughts come and go. You have seen that emotions rise and fall. You have seen that the mind moves, but you do not have to move with it. And in that seeing, even if it is small, even if it is only for a moment, there is freedom. Not the kind of freedom that removes all problems, but the kind that removes unnecessary suffering. A quiet freedom, where you are no longer pulled by every thought. No longer shaken by every feeling. No longer trapped inside the constant noise of the mind. So from this moment forward, do not try to become something new. Do not try to force yourself into peace. Simply remember. Remember to observe. Remember to pause. Remember that not every thought deserves your belief. And when the mind becomes loud again, as it will, do not fight it. Just return. Return to awareness. Return to the present moment. Return to that silent space, that has always been there, beneath everything. Because that space, is your true stability. That space, is your clarity. That space, is your freedom. Now before you leave, take a moment and reflect honestly. What is one thought, one belief, one pattern, that you are ready to stop holding on to today? Write it in the comments, not for anyone else, but for yourself. And if this message helped you even a little, save this video, so when your mind feels heavy again, you know where to return. And if you are ready to go deeper, subscribe to Timeless Mind Temple, where you don't just listen to wisdom, you begin to experience it. Stay aware. Stay present. And slowly, without force, you will begin to feel what true peace really is.